fix my hands and I'll let her walk." The judge mocked, his voice cutting through the silent courtroom like a blade. Before the bench sat Judge Thomas Carmichael, a man carved from guilt, his hands crippled by severe tremors since a fatal crash. He wore thick black leather gloves to hide his weakness. Standing opposite him was Regina Black, a ruthless billionaire, sneering with toxic arrogance. She demanded total financial ruin and the loss of custody for Eileen, a desperate maid who took $500 just to buy emergency oxygen inhalers to survive an asthma attack. To the elite, Eileen was invisible, just trash to be crushed. But they didn't notice Amber. The 11-year-old girl stepped out of the shadows, her gray eyes unwavering. Armed with the quiet mechanical logic of her late watchmaker grandfather, she saw right through their power. "I can make the shaking stop," Amber said, her voice steady. The room froze. That single promise was about to bring down an empire. Before we get into this story, tell me what time it is and what city you are watching from, so I know how far my story has traveled. Leave a comment below and please subscribe to the channel. Enjoy the story. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom remained shut as the weight of the 11-year-old's promise hung in the stagnant air. A collective gasp rippled through the packed gallery, followed instantly by the frantic scribbling of reporters' pens and a wave of aggressive murmurs. No one dared to challenge Judge Carmichael in his own domain, let alone a child dressed in a faded thrift store sweater. The magistrate leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Amber. His chest heaved beneath his dark robes. Slowly, he raised his right hand. The thick black leather glove trembled violently, betraying the severe neurological damage he fought so desperately to conceal. He reached for the wooden gavel, his hidden knuckles turning white, with the sheer agonizing effort to force his fingers to close around the handle. He struck the sounding block. It was not a booming crack, but a dull, strained thud that forced the room into absolute silence. Trial suspended for 30 days, Judge Carmichael declared, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that offered no warmth. "If this is a childish game, you will face the maximum penalty of the law. You have 1 month." He did not wait for a response, rising awkwardly and retreating to his chambers. The moment the side door clicked shut, the tension snapped. Regina Black bypassed the wooden partition, her designer heels striking the polished floor like a ticking time bomb. She stopped mere inches from Eileen, towering over the frail woman. "You actually think this pathetic circus will save you?" Regina hissed, her perfectly manicured fingernails pointing toward Amber. "You are nothing but a stain on my floorboards. When this month expires, I will unleash my entire legal team. I will ensure social services drags this arrogant brat to the worst foster care facility in the state, and you will be buried in so much financial ruin you will beg for the streets." Eileen flinched, dropping her gaze, her lungs instinctively tightening in panic. "Please, Mrs. Black," Eileen whispered, her voice breaking. "Mom, don't," Amber said softly, her gray eyes staring directly into the billionaire's furious glare. Regina sneered, pivoting sharply and marching out of the courtroom with her entourage. The suffocating cruelty of the billionaire's threat mirrored the exact terror Eileen had endured exactly 3 weeks prior inside the sprawling Black estate. The memory hit her with physical force. It had been well past midnight in the isolated mansion. Eileen had been scrubbing the grand marble staircase for 14 consecutive hours, her body pushed far beyond exhaustion. The central air conditioning was cranked to a freezing temperature for a lavish gala, and the sharp drop in temperature triggered a catastrophic asthma attack. Eileen collapsed against the wrought iron railing, gasping desperately for air as her chest caved in repeatedly. Her vision blurred, dark spots dancing at the edges of her sight. Regina had walked past her at that exact moment, adjusting a diamond earring in the hallway mirror. The billionaire merely stepped over Eileen's trembling legs, completely unfazed by the sight of a dying woman. "Clean up that spilled water before you leave, and do not make those awful wheezing noises in my house," Regina had coldly commanded, disappearing into the opulent East Wing without offering a single ounce of help. Eileen was drowning in her own failing lungs. Her prescription inhaler was completely empty, and her weekly paycheck had been deliberately withheld by the estate manager over a fabricated minor infraction. Dragging her paralyzing body toward the estate's main office, she found the petty cash drawer left slightly ajar. Pure panic and the primal, undeniable instinct to survive overrode her ingrained fear of authority. Her shaking fingers desperately took $500 from the stack of bills. She stumbled out the service entrance into the freezing, relentless Seattle rain, barely making it to a 24-hour pharmacy to purchase the emergency oxygen and medical supplies that kept her heart beating. To the elite occupants of that mansion, she was not a human being. She was simply a cleaning machine, entirely invisible until she dared to cross the line just to survive. Standing in the emptying courtroom, Eileen gripped Amber's hand tighter, the cold reality of their fragile existence pressing down on them. Rain lashed against the towering glass windows of the Carmichael estate early the next morning, casting long, warped shadows across the marble foyer. The heavy front door clicked shut behind Amber, isolating her from the damp Seattle morning. A tall, impeccably dressed butler looked down at her muddy sneakers with undisguised contempt. He did not offer to take her soaked coat, merely pointing a stiff, disapproving finger toward a long, sterile corridor. "Do not touch the walls, and do not speak unless spoken to," he instructed sharply, treating her presence like a vile infection, polluting their pristine sanctuary. Amber ignored his sneer, her gray eyes calmly analyzing the freezing environment as she walked past him in complete silence. The judge's study was a cavernous room lined with dark mahogany bookshelves, utterly devoid of any personal warmth. Judge Carmichael sat rigid behind a massive desk, still wearing his thick black leather gloves despite being indoors. He glared at the 11-year-old, projecting an aura of absolute, unforgiving authority meant to instantly crush the spirit of a desperate child. But Amber did not see a terrifying magistrate. Instead, she remembered her late grandfather's cluttered workbench, smelling faintly of machine oil and brass shavings. "When a complex clock stops ticking, never look at the hands," the old man used to say. "You must look past the surface to find the jammed gear." She applied that exact mechanical logic to the powerful man sitting before her. Instead of shrinking under his furious gaze, she meticulously studied his physical tics. She noticed how his broad shoulders remained unnaturally angled away from the east wall. Whenever he shifted in his high-backed leather chair, his eyes darted aggressively everywhere to the dense legal volumes, the ticking grandfather clock, the rain-slicked window pane, but stubbornly avoided one specific spot. It was a heavy wooden door, tightly locked, collecting a thin layer of undisturbed dust tucked into the far shadowed corner of the room. That avoided door was the jammed gear in his mind. "You are severely wasting your time, little girl," Judge Carmichael growled, his gravelly voice breaking the heavy silence. "I only humored your ridiculous stunt in my courtroom to avoid a chaotic media circus, nothing more." To visibly assert his physical dominance, he reached forcefully for a heavy crystal pitcher resting on a silver tray. He intended to pour a glass of ice water smoothly to intimidate her. As his gloved fingers wrapped around the thick handle, A violent, uncontrollable tremor hijacked his right wrist. The sudden spasm traveled rapidly up his forearm, shaking his entire shoulder. He gritted his teeth, his jaw locking, as he tried forcing the pitcher upward, but the neurological misfire was too overwhelmingly severe. The heavy crystal slipped from his failing grip. It crashed violently against the sharp edge of the mahogany desk and shattered onto the hardwood floor, sending dangerous shards of glass and freezing water splashing wildly across the polished surface. The judge froze his chest, heaving with humiliated, helpless rage, as he stared down at the ruined mess pooling at his feet. He fully expected the young child to flinch, to apologize profusely for upsetting him, or to run away terrified by his explosive failure. Amber did none of those things. She stepped carefully over a jagged piece of crystal and stood directly in front of his imposing desk. "My grandfather fixed broken things his whole life," she said softly, her clear voice piercing the tense, suffocating atmosphere. "He taught me that you can never repair a damaged internal spring if you just keep covering it up with a new casing." She pointed a small, steady finger toward his trembling fists resting on the blotter. "Those leather gloves aren't helping you heal, Your Honor. They are just a cowardly escape from reality. You wear them because you think nobody will see your weakness, but hiding the truth hasn't made the shaking stop." "Has it?" Judge Carmichael's face turned a deep, furious crimson. "Get out of my house," he whispered fiercely, a dangerous, trembling edge in his tone. Amber held her ground, glancing briefly at the locked wooden door before looking back into his conflicted eyes. "I will come back tomorrow, sir," she replied evenly. Down in the city's financial district, the neon sign of a 24-hour diner flickered weakly through the evening fog. Inside, the air smelled of stale grease and burnt coffee, a stark contrast to the sterile opulence of the billionaire's mansion. Sitting alone in a secluded corner booth was Silas Regina Black's personal accounting assistant. His posture hunched as he nervously stirred a lukewarm cup of black coffee. He rubbed his bloodshot eyes, a man thoroughly exhausted by the moral compromises required to serve his ruthless employer. He did not hear the diner's front bell chime, nor did he notice the small, quiet figure navigating through the empty tables until Amber slid silently into the vinyl seat directly across from him. Silas jolted, spilling dark liquid onto his neat cuffs. He recognized the 11-year-old girl immediately from the courtroom, his pale face draining of what little color it had left. "What are you doing here?" Silas hissed, glancing frantically around the diner to ensure no one from his corporate circle was watching. "You should be at home packing, kid, because Mrs. Black is going to ruin your mother." Amber did not blink, nor did she respond to the threat. Instead, she reached into her damp coat pocket and pulled out a thick stack of crumpled, partially shredded papers that had been meticulously taped back together. She placed them flat on the sticky formica table, sliding them toward his trembling hands. Silas stared at the documents, his breath catching in his throat. They were internal payroll drafts he had personally processed and then discarded into the estate's private dumpsters weeks ago. "My grandfather taught me that numbers are just like the teeth on a cog," Amber stated, her voice eerily calm and analytical. "If one tooth is shaved off, the whole wheel eventually slips." "You shaved off a lot of teeth, Mr. Silas." She tapped a small finger on a highlighted column. "You diverted thousands of dollars from the domestic staff's overtime budget into an offshore shell account disguised as maintenance expenses. When my mother's paycheck was maliciously withheld for a fabricated minor infraction, that money didn't simply disappear back into the corporate treasury. It went directly into the hidden secondary ledger you secretly manage for Regina. You are the silent architect balancing the books for her ruthless theft, ensuring the elite get richer while the invisible workers suffocate." Silas snatched the papers off the table, his hands shaking visibly. "You don't understand anything about how the real world operates," he whispered fiercely, leaning across the table with wide, panicked eyes. "Do you have any idea what that woman is capable of? She doesn't just fire people, she systematically destroys them. If I refuse to sign off on these ledgers, she will blacklist me from every financial firm on the West Coast. I would lose my apartment, my career, my entire future in a matter of days. I am just following orders to survive." He collapsed heavily back into the corner booth, running a frantic, trembling hand through his thinning hair, completely breaking down under the piercing, unforgiving scrutiny of a remarkably calm child. "I know it's wrong," Silas admitted, his voice cracking with a mix of shame and deep-seated fear. "I know she deliberately starves the workers to boost her own vanity funds. But I am just one tiny, insignificant employee in her massive empire. I cannot stop her. I have to play along to protect myself." Amber watched him carefully, analyzing his pathetic surrender, not with anger, but with the cold precision of a diagnostician examining a fatal flaw in a mechanism. "You think you are just a small gear, keeping yourself safe?" Amber said, softly, rising slowly from the squeaky vinyl seat. "But my grandfather always warned me about parts like you. He said a gear that blindly follows a corrupted motor, knowing it is grinding innocent people to dust, is not surviving. It is already entirely broken." She buttoned her damp coat, preparing to walk back out into the harsh Seattle night. You can keep letting her spin you until you are completely worn away, or you can finally jam the wheel and stop the machine. You have the original digital files. You know exactly what to do. Silas sat perfectly frozen in the dim, flickering neon light, staring blankly at the taped-together evidence scattered across the table. He listened closely as the diner's heavy glass door swung shut behind the young girl, leaving him entirely alone to finally face the unbearable, crushing weight of his own suffocated conscience. By the 28th day, the suffocating silence inside the judge's study had finally reached its breaking point. Judge Carmichael sat rigidly behind his massive mahogany desk, his chest heaving with erratic breaths as a severe, agonizing spasm ripped through his forearms. The dark leather gloves did nothing to mask the violent shaking that rattled his heavy frame. The physical therapy had failed. The isolation had failed. And now, staring at the 11-year-old girl standing quietly near the bookshelves, his frustration mutated into explosive, unadulterated rage. He slammed his crippled fists onto the blotter, the impact echoing sharply. "Enough," he roared, his voice cracking under the intense strain. "I have entertained this humiliating charade long enough. My hands are worse than they were a month ago, and my patience is entirely exhausted." He dragged his right arm toward the intercom console, his fingers struggling wildly to press the security button. "I am calling the authorities to have you permanently removed from this property. You and your mother will face the absolute maximum penalty in 2 days." Amber did not flinch, nor did she walk toward the exit. Instead, she pivoted sharply and sprinted directly toward the shadowed corner of the room, heading straight for the dusty, locked wooden door he had forbidden anyone to touch. "Stop right there!" Judge Carmichael bellowed, trying to push himself out of his high-backed chair, but his trembling legs betrayed him, forcing him back down. Amber reached the door, pulling a thin, modified steel tension wrench from her pocket, a delicate tool her grandfather had meticulously crafted for repairing antique pocket watches. She jammed the slim metal into the antique brass keyhole. She did not hesitate, relying entirely on the tactile feedback pulsing through the pins. With a sharp practiced twist of her wrist, a heavy metallic click resonated through the study. Amber pushed the heavy oak barrier inward, breaking a 3-year seal. The The stale air rushed out carrying the faint, heartbreaking scent of dried jasmine and old sheet music. In the dead center of the untouched sanctuary stood a magnificent polished ebony grand piano, completely draped in cold shadows. Judge Carmichael gasped, clutching his chest as if he had been physically struck by a bullet. "Shut that door!" he screamed, his face twisting in raw, unfiltered agony. "Do not look at it. Close it immediately." Amber stood firmly in the doorway, blocking his view, but refusing to close it. "You are not physically paralyzed," Sir Amber said, her voice cutting cleanly through his frantic yelling. "You are punishing yourself. You were driving the night of the fatal crash. The roads were slick. The steering wheel slipped right through your fingers, and you could not pull her back from the edge in time." The judge let out a guttural sob, his intimidating facade crumbling into a pathetic pile of profound grief. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head frantically. "It was my fault," he whispered hoarsely, the admission tearing its way out of his throat. "My hands failed her." Amber walked slowly back to the desk, standing inches from his trembling fists. "So you locked away her piano," she stated with clinical precision. "You sentenced your own hands to a lifetime of paralysis because you felt they no longer deserved to create the music she loved. You are wearing these black gloves as handcuffs, Your Honor. But you cannot fix the past by destroying your own future." She reached out her small fingers, gripping the edge of his thick leather glove. "Take them off." He resisted for a fraction of a second, his entire body shaking violently before finally surrendering to the crushing weight of his buried guilt. With agonizing slowness, Judge Carmichael peeled the heavy black leather from his right hand, then his left. His bare skin was pale, scarred, and trembling intensely. Amber gently grabbed his wrist and guided him out from behind the desk, leading the broken man into the music room. He stood before the ebony piano tears streaming freely down his weathered cheeks, hitting the dusty floorboards. Very slowly, he raised his bare hands and pressed his fingertips against the cold ivory keys. He pushed down. A single clear, resonant chord filled the stagnant house. At the exact moment, the sound waves vibrated through the air, the massive psychological knot strangling his nervous system violently snapped. The judge exhaled a long, shuddering breath. He looked down at his bare hands hovering over the keyboard. They were perfectly miraculously steady, without a single trace of a tremor. The morning news broadcast lit up the dark living room with harsh, glaring colors displaying Regina Black's face across every channel. The billionaire stood confidently behind a dense cluster of expensive microphones on the courthouse steps, perfectly styled and radiating malicious authority. She was executing a meticulously funded, ruthless media massacre. High-paid anchors parroted her corporate public relations team, running sensationalized graphics, deliberately questioning Judge Carmichael's mental fitness to serve on the bench. They broadcasted highly selective rumors regarding his prolonged neurological isolation, successfully painting him as a grief-stricken, cognitively unstable man being maliciously manipulated by a desperate, deceitful underclass family. But the public smear campaign was merely the visible surface of her brutal retaliation. Eileen sat entirely frozen on their frayed sofa, her trembling hands clutching a thick, official manila envelope that had been aggressively taped to their apartment door long before dawn. It contained an expedited emergency child welfare mandate, clearly fast-tracked through deeply corrupt bureaucratic channels. The stamped document legally ordered the immediate transfer of Amber into a notoriously harsh, state-run foster care facility by exactly 8 o'clock the following morning. Regina had unapologetically leveraged every expensive political favor she owned to bypass standard legal protocols, ensuring the total destruction of Eileen's family before the final 30-day hearing could even formally commence. The terrifying, undeniable reality of the elite's absolute power suffocated the tiny room, leaving Eileen weeping silently into her thin hands, utterly defeated by the rigged system. Amber watched the television screen in profound silence, her gray eyes calmly absorbing the sheer, devastating scale of the billionaire's counterattack. Suddenly, the harsh metallic ringing of their cheap kitchen landline shattered the heavy, oppressive atmosphere. Amber walked across the cracked linoleum floor and lifted the receiver immediately, hearing the frantic, hyperventilating breaths of a man standing in a massive, crowded space. It was Silas. The loud, automated voice of a transit announcer echoed in the background, confirming he was currently standing inside King Street Station. "They know," Silas whispered rapidly, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated panic. Regina's private security contractors initiated a full internal audit at midnight. They realized the secondary ledger drafts are missing from the physical disposal bins. She has ruthless corporate investigators tearing the executive offices apart right now, looking for the leak. Amber gripped the plastic receiver tightly, her knuckles turning white. "You have the original digital files," she reminded him, her tone maintaining its steady, analytical calm despite the rapidly collapsing circumstances. "You just need to bring them to the courthouse tomorrow." Silas let out a choked, hysterical laugh that bordered on a sob. "There is absolutely no tomorrow for me in Seattle. If her people find me before I reach a judge, I am completely finished. My financial career, my reputation, my entire life will be systematically erased by her lawyers. I cannot fight a billionaire empire kid. I am boarding the northbound train in exactly 10 minutes, and I am dropping off the grid." He did not wait for her to argue or offer a solution. The line went completely dead, replacing his terrified voice with a hollow, rhythmic dial tone. Amber slowly placed the receiver back onto the wall hook. The small, drafty apartment suddenly felt significantly colder than the harsh streets outside. Her grandfather had always warned her that stopping a corrupted mechanism required an incredibly strong anchor, but he never told her how agonizingly heavy that burden would feel. She was only 11 years old, completely stripped of any financial leverage or legal resources, facing a monstrous adversary who could rewrite the law with a single checkbook. Silas was fleeing the state, taking their only piece of concrete evidence with him. The aggressive smear campaign against Judge Carmichael was rapidly destroying whatever judicial authority he had left. The state welfare officers would arrive at their door in less than 24 hours to forcibly tear her away from her chronically ill mother. The overwhelming, crushing pressure of the impending devastation pressed down heavily on Amber's small shoulders. She stood motionless in the flickering light of the television broadcast, listening to the freezing rain batter the thin glass windows, completely surrounded by the encroaching darkness of an impossible battle. The courthouse was suffocatingly hot-packed, shoulder to shoulder, with reporters, elite socialites, and curious onlookers waiting for the slaughter. Regina Black made her grand entrance with the theatrical posture of a conquering monarch, flanked by a formidable army of high-priced corporate attorneys. She wore a tailored crimson suit, her lips curled into a triumphant, predatory smirk as she took her seat at the plaintiff's table. Across the aisle, Eileen sat trembling uncontrollably, her frail shoulders hunched in absolute despair, fully believing this was the final hour of their family. Amber sat quietly beside her mother, her gray eyes locked on the heavy wooden door leading to the magistrate's private chambers. The bailiff called the room to order. The side door opened, and Judge Carmichael stepped out. A collective, stunned gasp instantly rippled through the packed gallery. He was not wearing his thick black leather gloves. For the first time in 3 years, his bare hands were completely exposed to the public eye. He walked with a renewed, commanding posture, climbing the steps to his elevated bench. Reaching down with a perfectly steady, unyielding right hand, he picked up the heavy wooden gavel. He did not struggle. He did not hesitate. He struck the sounding block with a thunderous, authoritative crack that violently shattered the murmurs and forced the massive room into dead silence. "Court is in session," Judge Carmichael announced, his voice booming with undeniable clarity and absolute power. He immediately turned his piercing gaze toward the plaintiff's table. "Mrs. Black, I have thoroughly reviewed your emergency custody mandate and civil damages lawsuit. Both are fundamentally baseless, relying on manufactured grievances and an appalling abuse of the judicial process. Your petitions are entirely dismissed with prejudice." Regina shot to her feet, her meticulously crafted facade cracking instantly. "Excuse me?" she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the vaulted ceiling. "You are completely delusional. I demand an immediate recess and a psychiatric evaluation of this court." Before her lead attorney could pull her back down, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom burst wide open. The disruptive noise forced everyone to turn around. Silas stood in the doorway, drenched in cold Seattle rain, gasping heavily for air. He gripped a thick waterproof briefcase to his chest. He had stepped off the northbound train at the very last second, choosing to face his conscience rather than run from it. Ignoring the furious, murderous glare Regina shot at him, Silas marched straight down the center aisle and placed the briefcase directly onto the judge's bench. "Your Honor," Silas panted, his voice echoing in the silent room, "I am submitting the original, unedited financial ledgers of the Black corporate estate, detailing systemic wage theft, offshore embezzlement, and the deliberate financial strangulation of domestic employees." Judge Carmichael unclasped the briefcase with absolute precision, quickly scanning the top documents. A cold, righteous fury settled over his features. He looked down at the billionaire, who was now trembling with a mixture of shock and uncontrollable rage. "Based on the preliminary evidence submitted by your own chief accountant, I am hereby initiating an immediate federal investigation into your corporate empire," Judge Carmichael declared, his voice cutting like a scythe. "Furthermore, I am signing an emergency injunction to completely freeze all of your personal and business assets effective this exact second, pending a comprehensive federal audit." Regina lost her mind. "You cannot do this to me," she screamed wildly, flailing her arms and knocking over a heavy wooden chair, as 2 armed bailiffs quickly moved in to physically restrain her. "I own this city. I will destroy all of you." Her frantic, humiliating shrieks faded into the hallway as the security officers forcefully escorted the disgraced billionaire out of the building. The empire had officially crumbled in a matter of minutes. Later that afternoon, Amber and Eileen walked out of the heavy courthouse doors and stepped into the warm, clearing sunlight, leaving the dark shadow of elite contempt behind them forever. Walking down the stone steps, Amber looked up at the bright sky, finally understanding the true weight of her late grandfather's wisdom. She realized that arrogant power relies entirely on the silent fear of the oppressed to keep its corrupted gears turning smoothly. The greatest lesson was not about fixing broken parts, but knowing that unwavering truth, quiet intellect, and pure courage could easily dismantle the most terrifying machines. If you refuse to be a blind cog, no empire can ever completely crush you.